Hi, everyone. Doc T here with another episode of the Horses Advocate podcast. As I sit here and charge up my car someplace in Louisiana, I am trying to put my thoughts together based on so many podcasts and partial books that I've read in the past week, trying to put together something that makes sense to you guys as horse people, as horse caregivers, that will help us move forward in our ideas on how to take care of our horses correctly. The most common theme that I'm finding as I listen to the podcasts I subscribe to, and I try to get an eclectic group, both sides of the aisle, as they see in the political scene, because I want to really learn everything, the ins and outs of all things, and I want to present to you logical thoughts, at least to me, as someone who's been with horses for 49 years. I can't wait for 2023 because then I can say this is my 50th year with horses. It'll be kind of fun. And as I head into my 38th year as being a veterinarian, and I wanted to look at one basic, one basic thing through a couple of different filters. And that is, are we being taught what is correct? In other words, when we hear something, is it true? I like to tell people this one thought. About 500 years ago, a change occurred in how we think about how the earth is in relationship to the sun. And before that, we all thought that the sun circled the earth. We would sit here and see the sun come up in the east, what we called the east. It would go overhead and go down the west. And that made sense to us because it seemed logical. And our brains, most of us, don't have brains that have the time or the energy to be thinking deep thoughts. We are so busy in earning a dollar to pay our bills or to take care of our children, or maybe our elderly parents, or we have health issues ourselves. And we tend to focus on all those things. And we trust other people to tell us what is going on. We look at our doctors and we look at our veterinarians, we look at our healthcare specialists to help us make decisions. Just like we look at our auto mechanic to say what's wrong with our cars, and we trust that they know what they're doing, that they don't have an ulterior motive to gouge us, to steal from us, that they will be honest and forthright. We all want that in our lives. We want to trust our doctors, our veterinarians, the auto mechanic to do what's right. And yes, sometimes what they say hurts. It's scary, or it sounds expensive, or it is expensive. And we shy away from learning the truth because in the meantime, our dog got loose. He's eating the neighbor's chickens. We're having a health scare in one of our loved ones. The world might be coming to a war. All these things are happening. Who's going to get elected? And we sit here and we think, we've got so much on our plate. How can we possibly understand what's going on with our horses? It's almost like a sideshow. It's like, yeah, I've got a horse. They're fun. It fulfills me, but man, I only have an hour of time for them. And the other 23 hours, somebody else got to take care of it, or I don't have the time to invest in it. I just walk away and go into the house and try and take care of business. And then I go out for 15 minutes in the afternoon. I throw some hay in front of him. I throw some grain in front of him. I make sure he's breathing. And I say, you're fine. Or I kick him outside and say, I'll see you tomorrow, or whatever we do. We don't have the time to dig in and try to understand. But you're listening to this podcast, which means you've got some time. You're either cleaning your stalls or you're driving someplace. And you know that when you listen to this podcast, you're going to get really good information that can help you. And that's my goal, is to give you unfiltered, non-agenda driven information that helps your horse thrive in a human world. That's it in a nutshell. And so that responsibility falls on my shoulders as I get to drive all over this country and spend hundreds of hours behind the wheel. Thankfully, the car drives itself mostly. Sometimes I get carried away and find out I'm down to maybe, 3 miles left in the tank before I get to the charger. Will I make it? I better slow down so I can conserve on my electrons, which is what happened this morning. As they gave me a 75-mile-an-hour speed limit, I said, "Oh, this is great." So I'm doing 82, and all of a sudden it screams at me, says, "You're not going to make it unless you slow down." So, I mean, we all have our challenges on a day-to-day basis. And some of you listening to this may have been distracted and now just come back and said, "Okay, Doc, get to the point because, I got things to do." So let me get to the point. One of the things I listened to was a podcast, no, a webinar. And this webinar was put on by the American Association of Equine Practitioners, also called the AAEP. And this was called, gosh, I can't remember the name of it. Let me see if I can find it. It was kind of a catchy name that made me say, I've got to listen to it. It was called Fat, Fuzzy, or Foundered, ? Approach to diagnosis and management of horses with endocrine disease. I said, boy, that's right up my alley. That's exactly what I'm thrilled about. And I really wanted to find out what's going on. So I listened to it. It involved two veterinarians. One was Heidi Bancy. Dr. Heidi Bancy is at LSU, right down the road from where I am right now. And the other was Teresa Burns, who's up at the Ohio State Veterinary College. And these two ladies discussed endocrine diseases, and they started right off with Cushing's disease and the administration of Presend and Pergolide. And then they said some people are using another drug on these horses that aren't doing well on Pergolide. And good grief. I just drew a blank. Oh my goodness, I can't remember. But they were saying it's something that hardly anybody used. Well, it was the drug we all used before Pergolide came out, and we all got a hold of it. And dang it all, hopefully I'll put in the show notes because I'll think of it as soon as I hang up. I think it started with an M. But we used to use this drug all the time. But for people who are younger, they don't understand history. And that's the biggest fault we all have. I don't understand the history of the times before, such as I love to quote the fact that nobody had electricity on the planet, coming down wires in 1910, which is only 112 years ago. I mean, nobody had electricity. And it's a relatively new thing. Nobody had indoor plumbing until, basically 1950s. And even now, some people don't have indoor plumbing. And now most of us go around and it's just accepted. Hey, where's the baño? Where's the bathroom? And we go in and the toilet is there and it flushes and everything's fine. But nobody had that in 1950. Very few of us had it in 1950. So we look at some of these medications as being ancient or being new again. And we don't understand that they've been around for a while. But the whole idea is these two veterinarians discuss endocrine disease in ways of how to treat it. In fact, the whole premise of the talk was how to treat endocrine disease. And very little was said on how to prevent it in the first place. And this is my biggest problem with all medical professionals, human and veterinarians. They don't look at the root cause rather than how they can treat it and how they can test for it. So it's frustrating because with the testing, it's not clear what you've got. In fact, they were talking about insulin resistance, and they were talking about giving an oral glucose tolerance test where you give oral glucose in the form of Karo syrup. And we've been talking about this forever. But the honesty came out and they said, good luck getting this stuff down the horse. They hate it. It's like a battle. And so the range of results is very broad, and they're suspecting because some of these veterinarians can't get the stuff down into the horse. I mean, I guess you could stomach tube them and just put it in that way and skip the taste palate, but even the results, the actual giving the test is difficult in the horse. The actual giving the results back they're too variable, they're too broad. They discuss giving boy, this must be one of these mornings where the brain is supposed to be firing off, and it's just not. I'm going to pause this for just a second. Okay, I just had to put my brain to work. It's cyproheptadine that was used by us long time before pergolide came out, cyproheptadine. And they're discovering that might be an alternative to pergolide. It's not as good, but that was the drug. And now what I'm talking about is metformin. And metformin is a drug that people are giving to control sugar levels, blood glucose levels in humans, and they're now giving it to horses. And I found it interesting that they said most horses can't stand metformin. It tastes bad. It causes them to salivate. It just is yucky, and they just don't like taking it. And I don't think it's very effective in horses. You have to give way more dose than they think they're giving, because in humans they're finding that they have to give a bigger dose. But anyway, they talk about these treatments and they talk about these tests as if that's all we have. Nobody's talking about really reducing the amount of sugar that these horses are taking in. They did touch on soaking hay, and they were very concerned about bacterial overgrowth. And they said they found that hay that was soaked had a bacterial population that if it was steamed afterwards, that bacterial population died. Well, of course, steam kills a lot of bacteria, and that's fine. But I didn't hear them say what the bacteria count was on the dry hay before they soaked it. I didn't hear anything about giving soaked hay causing a problem in horses. And of course, if you've been listening to my podcast, I've been saying soak the hay for at least an hour, if not 6 or more hours, to get all the sugars out, and then rinse it all off. And somebody asked about rinsing, and they said nobody's done studies to see what the bacterial population is after you rinse it off. So there's so many questions that so many people have that they were just touching on, but not really addressing as far as endocrine control. What I've learned by listening to a lot of podcasts in human endocrinology and now horse endocrinology is that a lot of people don't know exactly how it works. Just when they think they understand it, boom, somebody else comes along, disproves them, and shows that there's something else going on. One of the theories that I've talked about, well, one of the experiments that I've talked about in the past, unrelated to diabetes, but definitely related to endocrine disorders in humans, is an enzyme that we've got that we don't use, that we don't create until we have a lot of fructose in our bodies and certain triggers come along like dehydration. So if you're eating a lot of sugar from fruits or high fructose corn syrup or fructose in table sugar, because remember, table sugar is 50% glucose and 50% fructose. But when you have high intakes of fructose in your body and high intakes of glucose in your body, everything's fine until you start to eat salt while you're dehydrated. In other words, you see the French fries and you shove the French fries in your mouth loaded with salt, and you get that in there until you feel thirsty. And then you take this swig of water or soda or whatever to rehydrate yourself. But it's too late, because when you add the salt, you become dehydrated, and it triggers an enzyme that we don't normally make, but is there because we're eating so much glucose. It's called aldose reductase. That takes glucose and converts it into fructose. So even if you're limited on fructose in your intake, it's going to take the high glucose from the starch from the potatoes that you're eating from the French fries, and it will convert that over into fructose. And the fructose will go through the Krebs cycle and bang out uric acid. And uric acid does so many things. It causes gout in men, not so much women until after menopause. It causes inflammation of the kidneys, and that leads to angiotensin dysfunction. That's the endocrine system that takes the kidneys, that controls your blood pressure. So it shows that you get increased blood pressure when you have increased uric acid. And then it also inflames the islet cells of the pancreas that's producing insulin. So it decreases the amount of insulin that's coming in, which doesn't help because as your glucose goes up, your insulin's supposed to follow to take care of that excess glucose. But if it can't because it's being inflamed by uric acid, the next thing you know, you've got this disparity and you have high blood sugar, which is type 2 diabetes. So here's this one enzyme that is being triggered by one, increased glucose consumption, and two, increased salt consumption. And this is why I recommend not adding salt to your horse's feed, because I don't know if they have this or not. They've found it in rats, in mice, and in humans. So why not in horses? And if you dump salt in there and they go and start to eat a salty food before they drink their water, you could be triggering this uric acid release. But nobody that I know of is actually studying uric acid in horses. But I'm suspicious. This is how my mind thinks. It just cascades down. You follow along now. That if you're feeding your horse high glucose levels, then one of the things that's occurring is you're getting high uric acid levels. It's a possibility. Please, somebody out there, show me what's going on. And these high uric acid levels causes hypertension. But could that also be causing inflammation of the lamina of the hooves? I mean, we know that we give a grain overload. These horses that are susceptible to laminitis get laminitis. Well, there could be a relationship just with uric acid. And if you learn how to control uric acid in the horse by maybe giving a drug that controls uric acid, as they do in men for gout, or stop feeding grains and stop feeding sugars, or soak the hay to get the sugars out, maybe we'll get the sugar under control, hence the uric acid under control, hence the inflammation under control, and the horses can start to walk again sound. I mean, these are the thoughts that go through my head. And here we have two veterinarians that are speaking. They're experts on the subject. They've been hand-selected by the American Association of Equine Practitioners to take a roundtable on endocrine disorders. And all they could talk about was glucose tolerance tests that are not reliable because we're not sure if we can even get the Karo syrup in the horses. We're getting a broad range of what is considered normal in a glucose tolerance test for glucose. We're getting, should we do pergolide or cyproheptadine for these dysfunctions of the pituitary, which I keep saying the pituitary is actually functioning exactly the way it's supposed to. I wouldn't call it a pituitary dysfunction. I would call it normal function that's not being told to stop doing something. So I guess you could call it a dysfunction, but all you have to do is stop it from sending out all these signals to produce high cortisol or antidiuretic hormone or whatever signal it has sends out that prevents them from shedding hair coat, and what other signals they're sending out, and get the pituitary to slow down. That would be really helpful. They talk about insulin resistance and they call it insulin dysregulation. Again, insulin is not dysregulated. Insulin is being regulated perfectly according to the instructions you're giving it. The insulin is going out there as best it can to control the glucose that you're feeding it. And then what happens is glucose gets greater than the insulin's ability to scavenge it up. It could be reduced from this aldose reductase that's causing the glucose to be converted to fructose. It's going through the Krebs cycle and spitting out uric acid. That's one possibility. The other possibility is that you're getting insulin resistance. So insulin is being bound to all this glucose and it can't really get rid of it. So it's not getting rid of it at the muscle cell, turning into glycogen or fuel. It's not going to the liver cell and being turned into glycogen. So maybe this insulin is bound up with sugar waiting in line to convert all this excess glucose into body fat. So the horse keeps getting fatter and fatter. The insulin keeps running back to the factory to pick up the spare glucose that's coming through the gut wall, and it's heading back out to the liver and it's dropping it off. And it's just a cycle that keeps going around and around and around. But they don't talk about this, which just bothers me to no end. There is such great information what's happening in the human world in metabolic syndrome, how metabolic syndrome could be behind asthma in horses. And there's more and more information about this. I was listening to one podcast from a fellow who's just brilliant, and he's talking about what occurred that changed in the mid 1900s. He said before 1970, and certainly before that, we were starting to get obesity, but obesity's definition of obesity in the early 1900s is different than it is today. Somebody who is obese, really obese, he said, was put into the circus, and you could go in and you could see the fat man. And he was like 300, 400, 500 pounds, and he was a freak. Now we see, 300 and 400 pound people walk around the street. We don't even bat our eyes at them anymore. We just start to accept it. And I start to see this in horses. So I was looking through a magazine that had a bunch of old photographs of horses from, when, Civil War days, late 1800s to mid 1900s, where horses were used all the time. And if you looked at their body configuration, you'd say, my gosh, they look like they need some more groceries. And yet they were building our nation. They were carrying our troops into war. They were carrying us to the Sunday dances, pulling our carts. And they were doing just fine. And they didn't have all these diseases and lamenesses. They were cared for well, but they were all lean. And these lean horses didn't break down. They weren't sick. And yet now we look around at all the horses, and almost every horse you see is well maintained, let's call it that, because of their convenience. And I touched on this in the last podcast, this epidemic of accessibility to food. And it's a life of luxury. And these horses are being overfed. So we have to be careful. Going back to my original premise that we believe everything that people tell us, we have to start to wonder, is it true? So we have an expression, horse needs hay in front of it 24/7. And I was just as guilty. I said, these horses don't have a gallbladder, so they can't store their bile. So they're supposed to be continually eating. And if you don't feed a horse for 24 hours and you look at his gums under daylight, you'll see that they've all turned jaundiced, or icteric, same thing, or yellow, because the bile is being excreted into their bloodstream and you get to see the yellow bile. And then we all thought this was bad. It meant that the horse had stopped eating. But I did say it took about 24 hours. Well, it turns out I have yet to see any evidence that says a horse needs to be fed 24/7. In fact, most of the people who stop feeding horses for about 12 hours, they feed the last flake of hay at, let's say, 6 p.m. and they don't get back to the barn until 6 a.m. and there's nothing to eat in between there. These horses are doing just fine. In fact, if they're laminitic and they're being fed soaked hay, they're doing even better than fine. They're actually now running in the paddock when they couldn't walk before. So, and some of these horses getting off the pergolide, their Cushing's medications, and a lot of them are getting off insulin dependency, and a lot of them are clearing up their skin problems. And many of them, the horses aren't coughing as much with allergic bronchitis, or actually breathing better. So there's all this happening in the metabolic syndrome. And again, my colleagues are going after how we can treat and how we can test, instead of saying, well, what's actually causing it? And even though these two veterinarians touched on it, they didn't dig down deep and start there and say, look, gang, we need to take care of the cause. Because quite bluntly and honestly, if we took care of the cause, then we wouldn't need endocrinologists anymore, because our endocrine system would be working, because it's been working for millions of years. It's evolved to work perfectly. So just keep thinking that all the horses and all the humans that we see that are getting sick is probably because they are responding exactly the way they're supposed to respond to what we're cueing them into. Now, you can talk about genetic disease, and I was so happy to hear this one podcast talk about genetic diseases as the cause of some of these problems. And they were laughing because it's so true. I've been saying this for years. It's not that that genetic trait runs in your family. What runs in your family is you eat like your parents and like their parents ate, and you're not changing things. And in addition, not only are you given the foods that they had, you're given even more foods. I mean, I just traveled a couple of hours and I had the chance to pull over multiple times to buy any food that I wanted. It's just there. And with the cars getting us around easily, that's really good. So we have to dig down deep and say, okay, what's really happening here? And for those of you who follow this podcast, I know you're starting to get it. I know you're starting to realize that, we have to dig down deep and understand that we have to trust the system the way it's evolved. The mechanisms that keep us healthy, that keep us alive, that keep us moving are brilliant and effortless. And when we start throwing foods at it and environmental pollution and stresses, we're going to cause our bodies to react. And what we're getting right now is cancer and cardiovascular disease, insulin resistance and other metabolic syndromes, osteoporosis, sarcopenia, which is a loss of muscle. We're getting everything we're telling our bodies to do because we're there. It's an effortless process. But when we start to say, okay, what can we do that'll change this? Then we start fighting ourselves. Just pardon me for just a second. I have to do that every once in a while. Otherwise, everything shuts down like the air conditioning. So there's an interesting podcast I listened to. It's an eclectic group that I listen to. And they talked about, the title was You versus You, which means that inside of you, you have a voice that tells you what you want to do. For instance, you want to stop smoking, or you want to stop eating, you want to lose weight, or you want to start becoming physically sound and responsible. And yet, when the cigarette comes out, you pick it up and you smoke again, or you drink the alcohol, or you eat the food, or you spend the money that you don't have. You look at all these things and you know better. And it comes to your horse and you know better. You know that you have to change what you're doing for your horse, because if you don't, the horse is going to become more lame, or never become sound, or become hard to handle, or become obese, and you have veterinary bills stacking up of veterinarians trying to cure what's wrong with your horse. And yet there's this other voice in you that says, wow, that cigarette smells good, that liquor tastes good, that food is so sweet and satisfying, that purse I need to buy, or for me, it's another computer. All these things come at us. And we have this yin and the yang, the two different personalities, one that knows better and the other one says, so what? You only live once and you could be dead tomorrow. And you keep going back and forth and you never think long term what you really want. And you look at your horse and you say, okay, this horse I love. And because he loves me, every time I bring out the treat bag or every time I scoop the grain and I pour it in there, he seems to show all sorts of love toward me. You do it because it makes you feel important, significant, loved. And yet, this other voice is saying, I'm listening to these podcasts and they're all saying, you've got to stop feeding the sugar, the inflammatory ingredients. You have to start adding the proteins that they're missing in their bodies. And you have to be patient. It lasts, 3, 6, 12 months, even 2 years to get them back on track because they've been going for so long. And at that moment, when the horse is nickering, you have that choice. Should I or shouldn't I? And it was really interesting what this one gal did who couldn't stop smoking. She was absolutely against anybody who's racist. She was all pro way of thinking that we're all equal and we all deserve the best. and anybody who is against your skin color is bad. And she couldn't stop smoking. And finally, your friend who did stop smoking said, "I can't believe you're still smoking." And she finally got mad enough. She said, "You know what? I'll tell you what. If I can't stop smoking, I'm going to write a $5,000 check and mail it to the Ku Klux Klan." And that was what did it. So now every time she looked at a cigarette, she said, if I smoke that cigarette, I'm going to have to give money to the antithesis of my beliefs. And that's what did it for her. And apparently that type of thinking, where you take that rational person that's inside of you that says, I know I shouldn't eat or drink or whatever. And I say, if I do, then I must do something that is even more painful. And that's what she did. I don't know what it's going to be for you. I don't know when you look at your horse and it nickers and paws and it says, show me your lovin', give me that spoonful of sugar. If that's going to be something that is going to be readily available and tangible for you to grab onto. I know I look at fried ice cream. You know, if you've never had fried ice cream, don't, because it's just so delicious with chocolate syrup over it, vanilla that's been fried in some cornflakes. Let me tell you, it's just so delicious. The textures, the crunchiness and the smoothness, the hot, the cold, all mixes in your mouth, and it goes down so good. But I look at that and I say, okay, I know what that's going to actually do in my liver. I say the same thing for alcohol. I know exactly what it's going to do in my liver. I know what it's causing in those cells. I know that it's going to excrete more fat that goes in between the cells. I know that that fat is going to clog my liver. It's going to fill my abdomen. It's going to make my life horrible in about 24 hours. And probably in about 3 hours, I'm going to have diarrhea. I'm going to have gas. I'm going to feel uncomfortable. I'm going to be belching and farting. And I know all these things are coming, and I do not want that. So now I look at this delicious bowl of fried ice cream and I say, is this what I really want? Because I know the consequences and they're real to me because I see it. And then as you get the weight loss, or you see your horse becomes a willing partner, or you see that the horse is now running around the paddock where before is laying down on the ground for almost a whole day because his feet were so painful. When you start to see these things, when you start to see, pardon me to my profession, but you see the vet bills start to diminish in your horse's life, your farrier saying, wow, I don't know what you're doing, but keep doing because I've never seen the horse's hooves look so much better. When you start to look at these things and hold on to it and realize that these are real, then you can look at the bag of grain and say, you know what? It's not that important. You can look at the body flesh on your horse and say, yeah, I know he's not that nice, chunky, round, fat thing that I thought I wanted, but, you know, I'm starting to actually see the athlete that he should be. And that athlete in there is performing, and he's turning 20 years old and he's still performing and he's still sound. And this is where, for those of you who are listening, I want to plead, and I don't know what else to call it, beg, plead, whatever. But you have to understand that if you believe in this and you actually do it, and your horses are showing an incredible response and benefits, you need to do something about this. You need to tell others. And the best way you can do it is, of course, you know, give a comment on your podcast platform, on the YouTube channel. Give a comment, subscribe. The more people who subscribe, the better off you are. I was just talking to Glenn the Geek yesterday. He is the most prolific podcaster on horses anybody. It's a horse radio network that he has. He's got, I think, 40 different podcasts that he either performs or produces, and they're all on horses. And most of you have listened to them. Horses in the Morning, any of these things. I've been on them. And some people have found me through there. But when I talked to him, I said, I think I'm getting something like 200 downloads each episode. He says, oh my gosh, you're above average. The national average is 160 downloads per podcast. And that just lifted my spirits. It means that a lot of you are listening to this, but we need to double and tenfold it. We need to get that many more people listening and understanding how our brain works, how the horse's brain works, how the metabolism works, and understand that it's not just an animal in your stall, that as the caretaker for that animal, you have responsibilities. That horse is struggling to do what it has been developed through evolution to do. And we as humans are blocking that. We're putting a fence up. We're not allowing them to graze on a variety of ground plants. We're limiting them to what's in their paddock. We're limiting them to this newfound thing called hay. Yeah, it's only like 60 to 80 years old for most of us. We're now feeding them according to what all the feed companies say that they should be fed. But what's in it for them? I mean, if they're not selling horse feed and horse supplements, they're out of business. So they're going to tell you how important it is that you feed those things. And yet we're seeing more and more diseases. And of course, the veterinarians are validating this by saying, yeah, we're here to help you. So when your horse does get Cushing's disease or can't breathe or is having sleep deprivation or is narcoleptic or, same thing, or is now getting nephrosplenic ligament entrapment colics, which we didn't have back in 1984. They did not exist. When we start to see the drop fetlocks in these horses and laminitis in horses instead of just fat ponies, we're seeing all these things occur: suspensory ligament injuries, kissing spine, white line disease, all these diseases that weren't there back in the 1980s when I went to vet school. We're seeing it now. And what is the cause? And now we're starting to understand what the cause is. And humanity is starting to realize what's happening to them. We didn't have cancer. It was not in the records in the mid 1700s. It only started to show its face in industrialized nations. And when the industrialized nations send out missionaries to these far-reaching lands, they reported back, these guys are healthy. They don't have cancer. And then sugar came in. And of course, everybody loves sugar. And some of these people who had no access to sugar started to get sick. Look at our Native Americans. They're obese and insulin resistant. The people who live in the tropical islands that have a lot of fruit, they're not, because they've evolved to take care of that. But you have some horses that come from dry countries like the Arabian Peninsula, let's say, or Iceland, or, other places that don't normally have a lot of fruit available and high sugar content. And now we're feeding them high sugar foods and they're getting obese. And we wonder why. And it's all there. It's all right in front of us. And maybe my mission on these podcasts is to bring to you, the podcast listener, these absurd silliness of this obvious connection. And that's what I'm trying to do. And I'll probably do this every time you tune in. I'll try to talk about dentistry because that's what I tend to do. But that's gone off the deep end as well. Try to talk about other things that are occurring in our horses. But everything I talk about, I laugh because I say, well, bear with me, but we're going to have to bring this back to possibly protein deficiency. And that's possibly because you're not feeding enough and they're over consuming it through gluconeogenesis. And if all this is unfamiliar to you, you have some digging in. The Horse's Advocate is where you need to go. The Horse's Advocate is my website. As of this recording, which is mid-August 2022, I'm in the middle of revamping the whole thing, so it's kind of destroyed, but you should still go there to see what's there and become a member, because the membership side is all up and running. It's working fine. Where we talk about things, we have rounds. The next one is going to be on inflammation and what is it and what causes it and how we can control it. But we discuss a lot of really cool things, and we try to get down to understanding the root causes. So just like we thought the sun circled the earth, it wasn't until somebody came around and said, no, I don't think so. And Galileo said, no, I think that we're a ball of earth, a rock spinning in an orbit around the sun. And Newton came by and he said, this is how orbits occur. That's fascinating when you think about that, because if you fire a bullet from a gun horizontal to the earth, and if the earth was flat and you drop the bullet from your hand at the same time from where the gun is fired, the same height, the bullet fired from the gun would hit the ground at the same time the bullet in your hand drops and hits the ground. And that's just pure physics. The problem is the gun shoots and the earth curves away, and so it's going to land further away than that. It's going to take longer to fall because as the bullet travels, the earth is curving down, so it has to drop just an inch or two further by the time it runs out of speed. And this is how planets are in orbit. They're constantly shooting straight, but then they're falling toward the center. But because the center keeps curving, we stay an equal distance away. That's the whole explanation behind orbits, which I think is fascinating. And our satellite Voyager has now made it to the far reaches of our universe, and they're now discovering that our universe has a fringe, and it's kind of interesting. They don't have all the answers yet as to what our universe is about. But now with the new satellites out there taking pictures, we're just one of hundreds of millions of universes out there. So our sun is one of 100 million out there. It's mind-blowing. So that might make you want to eat fried ice cream because you now feel totally irrelevant. I get it. But my goal is to live on this earth as long as I'm supposed to, as healthy as I can. And I want you to help your horses live as long as they're supposed to live, as healthy as they can. I'm tired of seeing sick horses that don't have to get sick anymore. So that's it at the Horses Advocate. That brings you up to speed about the latest AAP meeting. It brings you up to speed with some of the podcasts I've been listening to, some of the books I've been listening to. One is kind of controversial, especially if you're very politically motivated. It's written by a very liberal author who basically tears apart our medical system and how corrupt it is. It's like two sides of the aisle. We've got a left-leaning person talking about right-leaning issues, and they come together in this book. I'm not going to talk about it because I don't want to get political on here, but I listen. I'm listening to all sides. I'm trying to get the idea. And there's a lot of corruption and there's a lot of agenda-driven things. I have no agenda here other than to help your horses thrive in a human world. So this is Doc T. I hope you enjoyed this podcast. I hope my next couple of podcasts are going to be interesting. I'm thinking about getting some other people on here and talk about what's happening in our veterinary profession, about our horse world as it stands today compared to 50 years ago. And I hope to help us learn to help our horses now just become better horse owners. So thanks for taking the time to listen to me. This is Doc T. Be sure to go to the Horses Advocate. Be sure to subscribe, please. It doesn't take any effort. Just hit that subscribe button. And if you can, leave a comment. All of this goes into their programs to determine whether this is worth promoting or not. I would love to see this podcast rise to the top. I promise you I'm not quitting. Most of the other podcasts quit or fall flat. Oh my gosh, there's another podcast. I know you've reached the end, you're hitting the off button, but one more. I listened to Platinum Performance's podcast, and that they had a nutritionist and they had a veterinarian who worked for, does he work for Platinum Performance? I can't remember. But they, again, were talking about a lot of issues that are occurring in horses and how important protein is. And I said, oh, good, I've got to listen to this. They're going to talk about how important protein is. And they barely scratched the surface. I mean, they didn't talk about protein consumption. They didn't talk about decrease in the variety of amino acids. They kept saying that alfalfa and all forages are a good source of protein. And I'm like, no, it's not. It's missing so many of the amino acids. They talked about feeding branched chain amino acids and getting the top line to come along. And I said, oh, well, that's just fantastic. Now we're all talking about the top line. That's great. And the veterinarian really had some interesting stuff that talked about the anatomy. Kudos to him. I forgot his name to be honest with you, but it still fell short. I mean, they barely said you should supplement with some protein. And of course, they plugged a platinum performance product and they said that's really good, but they didn't talk about how much protein these horses needed to get them to where they need to go and to get their top lines right and how long it's going to take. I think they did say it takes a while to get there. Which is good. They had a couple of good things. They didn't really have anything bad, but they just were barely touching the surface. They didn't dig into it. So again, I'm listening to them all for you. I'm boiling them down. I'm trying to give you the essence and just do as I'm telling you. Feed no inflammatory ingredients, decrease the amount of sugar if your horse has excess body fat, increase the amount of high quality protein these horses need, which is basically soybean meal, but everybody's so afraid to say soy because they think it's such an evil thing. But for an herbivore like a horse, they love legumes. They love alfalfa and they love peanut hay, for those of you who have peanut hay, and lucerne, if you're out over in other countries that call it lucerne. And soybeans are a legume. And feeding them soybean meal is going to give them all the high quality amino acids they need to become healthy again. So what's your problem? It's ubiquitous. Everybody's got it. You might have to travel far to get it, but you can get it. It's relatively inexpensive. It's the best thing you could ever do for your horse. And I just spent a day yesterday working on a farm with these horses that were just, I mean, I took a look at her 30-year-old horse. I said, my gosh, I can't believe this horse is 30. This haircut was shining, absolutely shining. I teased her. I said, you rub this horse a lot. Oh yeah, I rub this horse a lot. You know, the horse is basically outside eating grass. It gets its soybean meal. It's her 8-year-old horse had a beautiful top line. My God, we'd die for a horse with a top line like this because she knows how to feed protein and stop feeding inflammatory ingredients. So, I mean, there's enough evidence out there of people doing it, and I don't get a dime for it. I mean, if you become a member of the Horses Advocate, that helps me get this message out, and you're supporting me. And I can't be thankful enough for all of you who become members of the Horses Advocate. Just do that. But for those of you who are just listening, just tell other people, you know, share this out there and get people to start listening. Anyway, that's enough. I've babbled long enough. Y'all take care, and I will be back next week with another podcast on something interesting about horses. I promise. Take care. Doc T out. Hey, everyone. Doc T here. Thank you for listening to my content. Would you do me a huge favor? Would you please subscribe, comment, like, thumbs up, and give a star review? However it's presented to you, I want you to do that. There's 2 reasons. The first, of course, is to improve this product. This way I know what you like, what you don't like, what I can improve upon, what topics you want me to cover. But more importantly, it's also going to help others find me. And by doing that, you are now engaged in this mission of helping horses thrive in a human world. By you helping, we can reach others. And that I would be so grateful for. And remember, go to thehorsesadvocate.com for updates on this information. Thehorsesadvocate.com. And again, thank you so much for being here. Doc T out.